Hello, everybody. Hi, Liz. Welcome.
Hi.
Okay, I am inviting you on video mode, so you'll have to accept once I send the invite, which I just did now, and then I'm going to join you up on video as well. Okay, there you are, and there I am. Hello.
Hi.
Just since this is your first time, and anybody who's watching us, if you want your video screen bigger, you can just put your thumb and forefinger on the image and drag it out a little bit so it's bigger and we can see you better.
Is that better?
Well, it's only on your screen, so everybody can do that individually to get a bigger picture.
Okay.
So
thank you.
Okay, great. And the audience members can do that as well. And I know that we have people who will be joining us, but we're going to go ahead and get started. Hello, Firesiders, and welcome to Adventures by the Book, where our mission is to connect people and communities through the magic of books. And boy, do we have a magical book for you today. I'm your host, Susan Macbeth. I'm delighted here to be chatting with Liz. And is it Michalski?
Michalski, yes.
Michalski. Okay, great. To talk about her new book, Darling Girl, which is a beauty. We're very excited to talk to her today. But before I introduce her, let's take a few minutes to go over the usual housekeeping. I did mention about the screen. If you want the visual image bigger, you can use your fingers to drag it out and make it bigger or smaller. You can even move it around on your screen if it's blocking something you want to see. You can also join us on stage at any time to ask questions or to make comments. And you just do that by clicking in the little round circle at the bottom left-hand corner of your screen. We call it the hamburger. And you just invite yourself up on stage. You can also react if you have something you want to clap or cheer. You can go to the react button and there's emojis with accompanying sound effects, and you can click on that as well. So, but without further ado, we want to chat with Liz now. So I'm thrilled to be talking to her. She has written a previous book called Evenfall, but she's here today to talk about her newly released book, Darling Girl, a novel of Peter Pan. Welcome, Liz.
Thank you for having me.
Yeah, we're thrilled to have you here. As a little bit of a background, Liz is a former reporter and editor and now crafts articles on human interest, living, and health as a freelance writer. She lives in Massachusetts, where she loves reading fairy tales and apparently writing them as well, and we're thrilled you did. But before we talk about your book, I always like to go back in time a little bit before you're an accomplished author and find out a little bit about your trajectory into the world of writing and books. And can you remember your early days when you were first smitten with books and writing, and how that developed and processed until where you are today?
I was definitely a late reader. I remember being in kindergarten and having my peers recognize words on flashcards, and I remember being really panicked that I didn't. And I didn't really read very much in first grade either. I remember my parents being a little concerned and bringing home different, educational games and toys. And then somewhere along the line, one of my godmothers gave me the Chronicles of Narnia, and they were the first books I remember just wanting to never stop reading. And I can remember being in second grade and reading I think it was the Voyage of the Dawn Treader, under the desk, because we had, those little school desks with the lid that shut. And I remember my teacher, who was lovely, just came over and very gently just kind of pushed the desk shut. And I think I read them all, within a month or two. I was just so engrossed by them, but I never really thought about writing as an author until much later. I wrote for my school yearbook, and I wrote for my college newspaper, but I never thought that I always thought that authors were kind of these just magical creatures who lived somewhere up high on the mountaintop and wrote beautiful, perfect prose at the first try. And I worked as a reporter, and my kids gave up naps very early, and I couldn't make the deadlines anymore. And I thought, well, what else can I do to keep from going crazy? So I would write a couple of sentences here and there, and that turned into my first book, Evenfall.
Wow, that's wonderful. And I know Chronicles of Narnia, that was my kids' favorite too. I wasn't introduced it until I had small children, and they just devoured it. So fond memories for sure. So, Darling Girl, can you talk a little bit about the inspiration for the book? I mean, I think most children or adults have read the book by now, or at least watched the animated version of it sometime during their childhood. But how many people have actually really thought to rewrite it or reimagine it in such an innovative way, especially since it's such an iconic and beloved story? So I'm wondering what inspired you to do so. And also, were you worried about how reimagining such a famed and beloved story would go over with readers?
Huh. Um, so I actually had this crazy dream. I have always had super vivid dreams, and I had this crazy dream where there was a girl in a Wendy blue dress in a stone tower with no doors, and there were windows that were just open. And these boys in Peter Pan green kept flying in and out of the windows, whispering, who will save us now? Because she was hooked up to all these medical devices. She's dying. Who will protect us? Who will take care of us? And I woke up and I was like, well, that's particularly creepy. And I started reading, I reread Peter Pan, which I hadn't read at that point in years. I had watched the Disney movies. I had loved the 2003 live action Peter Pan movie, which I think is just gorgeous. Um, and then I kind of went down the rabbit hole of Jay and Barrie's life, which was also really fascinating. And I just started writing it like that. Um, but for me, it wasn't, I've told the story a little bit, but I had given it to a friend who said, what's it about? And I said, it's about Peter Pan. Could you read it, please? And she came back to me and she said, it's not about Peter Pan. It's about something else, and you need to figure out what. And I went back and thought about it, and it really was more about, it's about mothers and, their relationship with their children. Um, and I wasn't really nervous about revising the story until I handed it in and I started looking for agents, because then I thought Peter Pan is a really beloved character. I mean, he's very, very dark in the original. If you go back and you read it with that eye, he does some really creepy things. But I never really thought about it until I had handed it in, and I thought, oh, he's such a beloved character. There may be people who don't like this, but I didn't really write it for anyone else. I wrote it for me. So
Which is the best way to write it, right? If you're writing it for somebody else, you're not going to be an authentic writer for sure. Can you talk before we start talking about the book? Can you just give a little bit of a background on J.M. Barrie, the author of Peter Pan?
Yeah, so he's really fascinating, or at least he was very fascinating to me. And then the more I read about him, the more it really made me look at Peter Pan in a different way. So his mother was her his grandmother passed away when his mother was about 8. So at 8, she really had to step up, and she was the woman of the household. She was responsible for everything. And when she married, she had children, and her golden child was the oldest child, and he died very unexpectedly in a skating accident when I think he was 14, and it devastated her. She really never recovered from it. She took to her bed, which had a tremendous impact on Barrie. There's actually a podcast called Radio Lab, and in one of their podcasts, they talk about stress and what that does to you. And Barrie really never grew. He, I think, topped out at somewhere just under 5'4", and he never really kind of developed into a robust young man. But when his mother died, she just kind of disappeared to him. And he recalls going in and talking to her and dressing in the child's clothes of his dead brother. I'm sorry, can you hear that? That's my son who's
Oh no,
can you hear the dings in the background? Oh, okay.
you're good.
Um, so he wound up dressing in his dead brother's clothes and going into her room and standing the way his brother stood with his hands in his pockets and whistling the way his dead brother whistled. And his mother said, "Is that you?" with his hope in his voice. And he said, "No, it's only me." And I don't think he ever really recovered from that. I think that he really, spent kind of the rest of his life looking for something to fill that hole in his heart.
Wow, that's really sad.
Yeah, it's really tragic. And he, his the rest of his life he married, but the he married an actress actually, and the wedding wound up being dissolved on grounds of I believe not being consummated. And he met the children that he based the Darling Boys on, uh, the um the the Darling family on, um, and it felt almost like everything he ever touched kind of disappeared or died on him. The father of that family developed a very severe form of cancer and died.
Mhm.
Barrie kind of stepped into the role and took over the family. And a few years later, their mother passed away. And Barrie, at that point, had kind of intertwined himself with the family such that he wound up with guardianship of the boys. And the boys all, most of them met tragic ends. One died in the war, one drowned under very suspicious circumstances, one committed suicide by stepping in front of a train. So it's a very, very dark story.
Wow, it is. And there's so many tragedies intertwined. Oh my gosh.
So
So,
not to bring the podcast down, but you asked about his life, so.
so your reimagining is, I don't want to give the story away because it's very unique and but it starts with Darling Girl. Would you say your focus is her? Would you say it's a reimagining of her, Peter Pan, all of them? For those who need a refresher, if you haven't read it since childhood, remember Darling Girl is the young girl, the eldest of the Darling family, who's befriended by Peter Pan and flies away to Neverland to be a mother to him and the lost boys. So um, I'm just curious, in light of feminism and the Me Too movement, was your message really about empowering women and told through Wendy? And how did you decide to do this?
There are a couple of things that I was thinking about. One is that I love fairy tales. I love the Peter Pan story, but the mothers in that story are just such afterthoughts. They're and the mother figures too. I mean, Mrs. Darling, we very obviously wrote about her in a very intense way. He talks about her as her mind being this series of interlocking boxes, and every time you open one, there's something more to open, except for that very last box, which no one ever gets to. And which to me meant that she had a very active um, internal life, but we never hear anything about it. And the same with Wendy. Wendy is kind of a mother figure, she goes to Neverland, but she doesn't have the same adventures as her brother. She's in charge of bedtime and housekeeping and, making sure the imaginary food is served. And even Tinkerbell is kind of just an echo of Peter Pan. And I thought, what if the story was told from the point of view of the women? How would it be different? What would Wendy really think about going to Neverland? What was Mrs. Darling doing? Well, besides waiting for her children, how would it look if it was imagined from their point of view? And I also wanted it to be, I love magical realism. I love stories that imply that, you can go around the corner and open your closet and anything can happen. You can find this whole new world there. And I knew I wanted to set it in our time. But I also was very aware when I was writing it of the Me Too movement and how hard it was for women to come forward and how many women had stories. And I thought, why haven't their stories been told before? Well, it's because the stories that are being told from someone else's perspective. Um, and for me, Peter Pan was kind of the ultimate who tells the story line, because we've really only heard it from his point of view. We've really only seen Peter as the hero of Neverland, and what would Wendy really think about that? And what would her children think about that?
Right. And on the subject of women, there's this societal expectation that women must never age, right? It's acceptable or even distinguished for men to have gray hair, but not women. I mean, I fall into that trap too, right? Is every 6 weeks, right? I'm at the hairdresser. And it's acceptable for men to allow their faces to age and their bodies to age naturally and to look distinguished. But women are encouraged to nip and tuck and lift to stay young. But your protagonist, Holly Darling, runs a skincare company. So, what message are you planning with this character device?
I thought it was a really fun way to look at the idea of never aging and how that really is something that is the bedrock for women. And even her name in the original story, it, Barrie kind of gives a throwaway line to Jane's daughter, which is supposed to be Margaret. But I figured that we were, kind of far enough removed, and enough people wouldn't be familiar with that I changed her name to Holly, because a holly is something that's evergreen, it's ever young. So that was kind of a play on it as well.
Yeah, I like that. I like that. Another theme in your book is about family, right? So, how did you portray the Darling family in your book? And did your experiences with your own family influence your telling?
I'm really interested, and I always have been, in family dynamics, particularly with mothers and daughters and mothers and sisters. And I thought it would be really intriguing to look at how different generations looked at the same story, because how Wendy looks at it is very different from how Jane looks at it, which is very different from how Holly looks at it. And why there are those differences. Is it just their age? Is it societal views and pressures that have changed for each generation? And how does that influence how they interact with each other as well? And also, it's for me, a lot of it was when I was writing it, my oldest was getting ready to go off to college. And there's such, parenting teenagers is challenging, even when you have wonderful teenagers. And I'm really lucky; I have great kids. But it's not even parenting them per se. It's that whole, um, it's the shift in the relationship where for 15 or 16 or 17 years you've kind of watched over everything you've done. You've been by their side. They've wanted to be with you, and now suddenly they're the ones who are going off on the adventures, and you're the one who's staying home and waiting up, and worrying, and you can't go with them. They're, for many reasons, but they're not going to let you sit in the back seat when you go. When they go out with their friends or whatever. And so I was thinking about that a lot, and how what it meant to be a mother for each woman in my story. Um, and I just think that they're like most families. There's conflict between them, and they may not be able to live together, but at the end of the day, when the chips are down, they still love each other and they still will do anything for each other.
For sure. And did you read Peter Pan with your kids growing up? I don't know how many kids you have.
I have two, and I don't think I did. I know that, and we read a lot. I mean, we did a ton of audiobooks in the car. Up until they started driving on their own, we always had an audiobook in the car. But Peter Pan was not something I really revisited during their childhood or even their adolescence. We did watch, as I said, the movies, and I was particularly fond of the 2003 version of it. Um, but no, we didn't. And in a way, looking at it, it is a really dark story on its own. And I'm not sure how well that would have gone over.
Now that they're older, did you talk to them about your book and what you were planning?
I talked to them. I don't know if they hear me, but I talked to them about it. Um, they're both really good storytellers. My daughter is a really good writer, and when I was I knew how I wanted it to end, but I was struggling with how I got it there, and I had written, I think, a couple of different endings. And I finally had her in the car one day, and I said, this is what I'm doing. This is where I am. What would you do? And she told me, I was like, oh, that's a really good idea. And I kind of adapted it. And my son has an impeccable gift for verbal storytelling. He has perfect timing. So every now and then I'll run something by him and he'll, kind of give me a hard time about it, but it's always fun, and it's always something that makes me, I think, change it and tweak it so that it's a little bit better.
That's great to have built-in editors.
Built-in critics too, yes. So,
As teenagers are wont to do, right?
right.
So the book takes place partially in London, which I understand that you lived in London as a little girl. Can you tell us a little bit about your experience living there, what memories you have, and what memories did you draw on for your book? And also
Yeah.
curious too with COVID, were you able to travel back to London to do any research for your book? Did you need to do that? Have you been back recently?
So it was actually my junior year, not when I was little, but I spent a semester abroad as a junior, and I wound up working for a member of parliament, which was just, a fabulous, amazing, life-changing experience. And I got to go into the House of Parliament. I got to sit, in the stands when the House of Commons was in session. I got to have tea in these, this little private room that was for just members and their guests. And I wish, and I really loved every minute of it. I wish that I could go back and do it now because I think I would love it even more. And my member of parliament took me all over. He took me to Cornwall, which was their district. He took me to a lot of the spots that I mentioned in the book, and I wound up going back as much as I could up until I had children, and then I didn't go back for years, and I was able to go back just 2 years ago with them, just before COVID. It was one of our last trips, and see the city in a way that allowed me to remember what I had experienced, but also to kind of see it through my children's eyes, who were teenagers at the time, which was just very, very special. And, it was kind of like reading an old friend that you haven't seen for years, because um, their facade changes a little bit, but after a couple of minutes, you just fall back right to where you were, and you recognize them. And that's what I felt. It felt a lot like going home and going to some of my old favorite spots. So I didn't wind up going um, for research, but I was able to do a little bit of research while I was there. And I felt like the most of the places that I write about are just so iconic, um, that it's almost like using shorthand for people. So that they read it and they're kind of instantly back there.
So did you have any particular experiences or people or food or sites that stuck with you that you wanted to weave into your book somehow?
There's a scene in Cornwall, which is very much based on an experience that I had there. I remember staying overnight, and in this room that was just very, very, very bland, and just being a little bit surprised. And in the morning, pulling the curtains and seeing the water and the beach and the grass, and just being amazed by how intense and how beautiful the colors are. And there is a scene when Holly meets one of the characters in a bar, and the bar is based on an actual bar that I love, um, in London. So,
Oh, that's great. That's great. And I just want to remind everyone, where did I set my copy of the book? That in the fortune cookie of your screen, in the middle of your screen, is our website, adventuresbythebook.com, where you can go and purchase a copy of this beautiful Darling Girl,
thank you.
written by Liz Michalski. And Do you want to chat for a few minutes about your first book, Even Fall? And I'm wondering, it's very different from Darling Girl, but is there a common thread that runs between them? Uh,
You know, one of the ways that I write is setting is really important to me. And I feel like parts of Darling Girl are a love letter to London and to Cornwall. It was a really pivotal time in my life. It was, really life changing. When I went there, I was a coffee drinker. When I left, I was a tea drinker. Um, it was the first time I had really been on my own, very far away from family. And I think that those experiences really helped form who I am. And with Even Fall, it's a little bit of a love letter to rural Connecticut. I moved there in my 20s and I stayed there for about 10 years. We had a, a horse farm that is very much like the setting described. And when I was writing my book, I knew when I was writing Even Fall, I kind of knew in the back of my head that for us, it wasn't an ideal situation to raise kids. It was just a lot of property to manage. We were far away from family, but it was someplace that I really and truly loved. And I think that Even Fall, in a way, is a love letter to that period of time in my life and to that setting. So even though the stories are very different, I always say Even Fall is kind of like Ghost Quest with Notebook. It's about a man who falls in love with one woman, marries her sister, and then spends the rest of his life and his afterlife trying to make amends. And Darling Girl is about the Peter Pan experience and about motherhood. I think that they have that in common. They're both very much love letters to a time and a place in my life.
yeah, lovely. That's lovely. Um, the book talks a lot about the power of nostalgia and childhood magic. Um, but your book also takes a dark turn, and I don't know how much you can talk about that without giving away anything because we do want people to read the book. But can you talk a little bit about the power of nostalgia and returning to magical stories as an adult?
Yes, I think first of all that fairy tales, the original fairy tales, are incredibly dark. Not the ones that have been done by Disney, and I love Disney. I love their movies, but the ones that you read, they are really terrifying when you think about it. I mean, in Cinderella, the stepsisters wind up cutting off, at least the versions that I have, because there are different versions. They wind up cutting off their toes and their heels to fit into the shoes. The stepmother winds up, I think, dancing in heated iron shoes until she dies. In some of the versions of Snow White, it's not the stepmother who is threatened by Snow White's beauty, it's her mother who drives her out of the house. They're really, really kind of scary. And I think that they are, for adults, they're not exactly a warning, but they are an example of how we know life to be, that it's really, really beautiful, but there aren't necessarily happy endings. And that even if you are a good person and you follow the rules and do the right thing, really terrible, scary things can happen. And I think that that is um, one of the reasons my book is the way it is, because I think that as an adult, you're seeing magic, the magic that you experienced as a child for a second time, and you're seeing it through your own child's eyes. And you desperately want them to have that experience, and you want them to have it without any disappointment or any marks or any danger. But because you've lived it and you've grown up and you've come out the other side, that that's really impossible. That you can't protect them forever. That you can't um, always keep them safe. And so that, in my book, magic has a price, it has a cost, just like adulthood has a price and a cost. And I think it's kind of a very realistic grounding of the story that way.
Yeah. You also talk about the power of the dog that you've written dogs into your books. And do you have a dog? And tell us about the relationship with your dog and how it affects your writing.
I have a great dog. I am a huge dog fan. Sorry to all the cat lovers. No apologies. No ill will meant. My first book, Even Fall, the dog is actually based on a real dog that was kind of a local farm dog who kind of milled around all the different houses. And, when there was a thunderstorm, she would come to my house and she would wind up sleeping in the basement. She would see the UPS people come, and, my dogs were on my deck perfectly relaxed and happy. And she would see the truck and come charging over to save me. And I think that having dogs or pets in writing lets you show a different side of your character, because the character may do things that they wouldn't do with a person, and they may reveal themselves in a way that they wouldn't reveal themselves to anyone else. And I have a great dog. I have a 12-year-old boxer Ridgeback Cross who's about 80 pounds. And if you look on my Instagram, I routinely dress him up. He was just Tinkerbell for me when my book came out. And he's a very good sport about everything I ask him to do.
So we can find that on social media if we follow you.
Yes.
Oh, and
Sadly, yes.
where would we follow you on social media, Liz?
I'm on Instagram and Facebook and Twitter. And it's Liz Michalski, author, in most of those places.
Liz Michalski, author. And also, you can click on Liz's link here at the top of your screen and follow her, which means that anytime she's on Fireside, you will get notification of that. You can also follow me on Fireside so that you can visit any of our author events, which we host pretty much weekly on Fireside. So I only have a few more questions for you, but I really like to open this up for questions from the audience. And in particular, I'd like to hear people's memories or stories of fairy tales in general, or Peter Pan specifically. What you remember, how it affected you. Do you read those books to your kids? I also see that your publicist is in the audience. I'd love to chat with her about getting the project and her thoughts on that too. So yeah. The other question I wanted to ask is that when I was reading your press release, it said that this is your first foray into storytelling or fairy tale stories. So what does that mean? This is your first one. What, do you have something else in the works, or is this going to be a series? Or
For me right now, I tend to wind up thinking about books a lot before I write them. So in terms of a prequel or a sequel, I'm kind of muddling around with that, but I think that my characters need to go off and have some adventures and then kind of come back and fill me in. Um, but I am really drawn to fairy tales, and I am working a little bit on a different one. I'm still in the stage where I'm kind of sneaking up behind it and trying to catch it. So I don't want to talk too much about it. But for me, they're such powerful stories because they're so old, and we still tell them over and over and over again in different guises. And that's how I feel about Peter Pan too. It's not a true fairy tale in the sense that it's, from a very, very long time ago. But the original book is it's very short. It's about 240 pages, but it's just so beautiful, and every word has weight. And for me, at least, I was always fascinated by the characters and wondering, what else they had done and what else they were doing. And I think it's such a testament to J.M. Barrie that there have been so many different versions of this book. There's Peter and the Starcatchers, which is a wonderful one by David Barrie. There's Tiger Lily by Jodi Lynn Anderson, which is a phenomenal book. There's so many different live productions of it. I think that he just really stumbled upon something that is so moving, and he also left a lot of room in that book for the rest of us to imagine it in different ways.
and are there any descendants? I know that the Barries, they had a kind of a tragic story in the Darlings, but are there any descendants left in the Barrie side or the Darling family that people keep in touch with, and uh, that
I
they
don't
go out
know.
and talk about?
I know that J.M. Barrie never had children of his own. I don't know about the Llewyn Davies boys, the ones that Peter Pan were kind of all based on. But that's a really interesting question. I'll have to look for that. Thank you.
Yeah, interesting. I know a lot of people who write about, stories like that. Then they research descendants and try to talk to them. And I was just curious if there was any of that going on. And what kind? I know your book is just released, but I'm wondering, do you have kind of early responses? I know I've seen some of the quotes that you got for your book, which are glowing. But I'm wondering if you've had a chance to have readers reach out to you already, or is it too early in the game?
No, I mean, I try not to read reviews because I think that it's just, it's just a very dangerous thing to get into. Um, but the people who have reached out to me, seem to have really, really loved it and enjoyed it. And, for me, the excitement is that they aren't just reading the story, they're thinking about it. They're thinking about, what happens to the characters next and, where did the characters come from? And I love that. To me, that's what really happens in my favorite books. I close the last page and I start wondering about, what they're doing now. And I tend to think of writing as a snapshot in a period of a character's life as opposed to a whole movie. And they have things that happen before the book and they have things that happen after the book. And you know, as a writer, I try just to capture that one moment. And I love that people are kind of thinking about it the same way.
Yeah, and so you wrote this book for yourself, but what do you want readers to get out of the book?
Um, it's what's really interesting to me is that it is a lot of the people who write to me um, really seem to get that it's not just a story about Peter Pan. It's really a story about motherhood. And, the love story um, for me is between the darling women. It's the love story between, so love that Jane has for her daughter, Holly. It's the love that Holly has for her daughter, Eden. Um, and I think that's really powerful. And I think that the whole idea that, motherhood is often the time when you're faced with making choices that are hard choices. And, no one is ever going to be 100% happy with what you do, but you go ahead and you make those choices anyhow. And they aren't always understood until later.
Agreed. Agreed. I know that you got these great quotes. I'm looking at some of the names. I mean, Patty Callahan, who's one of my personal favorite authors.
She's lovely.
Captivating question quivers at the center of the engrossing novel, Darling Girl. What if Peter Pan isn't just a story? And I'm curious, can you share a little bit of the plot that you developed without giving anything away? I know that's going to be hard to do, but kind of a general plot so people can get a sense of how you decided to reimagine the story.
Yeah, for me, it was the Peter Pan part of it was really simple. It was, Peter Pan always says he's never going to grow up. And I thought, okay, well, what if he doesn't grow up, but he still gets older? Because we've all kind of known people like that, and I think of him in the book, and he reminds me very much of a toddler. And if you've ever been around toddlers, they have these very big emotions about what they want and why they're entitled to it, and they want it now. And I
Yes.
see Peter as kind of an oversized toddler. And there's one of my favorite books is The Ocean at the End of the Lane by Neil Gaiman. And in it, he says something like, all children think they are gods. And I thought, well, what if the boy who thinks he's a god gets older, but still has those same emotions and never really learned how to control them? What happens then? Will he love very intensely? Will he hate very intensely? So that was kind of the framework that I built the Peter Pan aspect of it on.
Yeah, it was very clever. I see that Amber has joined us up on the stage. Hi, Amber. Did you have a question or a comment for Liz?
Hi, Liz. It's awesome to meet you. I haven't had the chance to read your book yet, but it is up next on my ever-growing reading list, so I will get to it soon. I had a comment and a question. My first comment was I actually took a folk literature class in college, and I loved that class, and we got to read a lot of like the Grimm's fairy tales, and they were very, very dark and like so much different than the Disney, stories that I grew up with. And I loved them more for that because I just felt like they were more real and it wasn't just happy endings all around. And so I liked that realism in it, even though the Little Mermaid that I didn't like that ending, but still love that
Neither
story.
did I.
My question to you is when you were writing Darling Girl, was there a character that, you kind of identified with or just was easier to write with? And then on the opposite end, which character were you, finding it the most difficult to write for? And that's my question.
That's a very good question, Amber. Thank you very much. I think that, you know, based on my location in life, Holly was in some ways both the easiest and the hardest to write because I knew that feeling about not wanting to let your children go and wanting to keep them safe and wanting to do, anything you had to do to keep them in a position where they wouldn't get hurt. And also the hardness of realizing that, you can't do that. Um, Making her likable for some of her decisions was difficult. She starts off, I have some stories in there that show that she wasn't always like this. Like everybody's mother, they were not always your mother. They used to have a life before you, and they did fun and cool and wild things. And showing that side of Holly was really essential for me to kind of soften her up a little bit, show that she had once been this kind of wild, free spirit, and then all these tragedies had happened, and her reaction to that was just to say, "Everybody, you're staying right where I can see you within arm's length at all times." She doesn't actually say that, but that's kind of the vibe she gives off. So she was kind of the dual easiest in that sense, and also most difficult. But the most fun to write for me was, I think, Jane or Tinkerbell. Jane, because she is just so snarky, and I think probably, I am the dowager on Downton Abbey already in my life. If you annoyed me, I would secretly like just to whack you with my cane. So getting that out was really fun. And Tinkerbell was really fun too because she's very physical. She, in Peter Pan, she doesn't really speak, not so that we can hear her. She always has to have a translator. And so I played with that a little bit and just kind of having her express how she feels and what she thinks through her body language was really, really fun. So thank you. Great question.
Thank you so much. That was awesome.
Thanks for the question and comment, Amber. And as a reminder, anyone can join us up on stage by clicking their little circular button on the lower left-hand portion of your screen. Invite yourself up, ask a question, or make a comment. I don't want to delve into many details because I do want people to read the book. So let's pivot a little bit and talk about your writing process. I know writers have some common themes. They talk about whether they're plotters or pantsers and what their daily routine is. Can you talk a little bit about that? Because I know we always have budding writers in our audience.
Yeah, so I am a recovering pantser. I am much more of a pantser than a plotter, but I have found that it helps to have a loose outline and to have some plot points. I tend to think about a story for a long time before I write it, and I usually spend the most time on the first chapter. And by the time I go to write my first chapter of all my books, I have pretty much got it down word for word in my head. And then once I have that, I have almost like stepping stones where I can see the next plot point, and I just have to figure out a way how to get there. And those are kind of the stepping stones that lead me all the way home. I don't always have a set writing routine. I try to write in the morning. I actually lost my office during COVID to my husband because he needed four walls and a door. So I was writing at the kitchen table, and everybody would be walking in at noon just when I was getting going and asking about sandwiches or what was for lunch. So I have since relegated myself to the garden shed, which my husband and son did over, which is it's a very great space, except I'm in New England, and then when it gets below 30 degrees, it gets pretty chilly. So I go out there with my down coat and my gloves and my my fingerless gloves and my hat and my space heater, and I hang out there. And I find that I wind up waiting sometimes, a week or even two before I tackle a chapter. And I'll just keep rereading what I've written and tweaking that and working on that until I have it where I want it. And then I feel like I can go ahead and write the next chapter.
And so can you talk about what you're working on now?
I'm still kind of mining different fairy tales, and I'm trying to bring them into where we are today. But I'm like I said, I'm afraid if I say too much, I'll chase it off. So I'm trying to just sneak up behind it.
Oh, okay. All right. So we're about out of time unless there's anybody else who wants to join us on stage, but I want to give you a chance to chat about anything or bring anything up that we haven't talked about, any points that we've missed or.
No, I mean, again, for me, the power of fairy tales and the joy of being able to mine them and bring them to life in different ways is that they really address universal concerns. And I think Peter Pan is one of those stories that everybody should go back and read if they've, read it again, but also if they've never read it for the first time, because the language is just so beautiful and so lovely. But it's also a really sad story. It's sad on so many different levels. There's just a real melancholy that runs through it. And I think that that's what I love about adult fairy tales is that you have the joy and the happiness and the magic, but you also have the knowledge that it doesn't last forever.
Yeah, that's true. I was just thinking about the fairy tales I was reading growing up, and I think because I had a German mother, I was used to having the European versions, which are all very dark. The Hansel and Gretel, that the witch is going to cook the kids in the oven and that type of thing. So I'm used to the dark side of fairy tales. But I've enjoyed chatting with you. And last chance for anyone to join us, last minute questions before we sign off. You've already mentioned where we can find you on social media. I wanted to mention a couple of upcoming events we have for those of you who are in the San Diego area or Southern California. We're doing an in-person trip to the Huntington Museum and Gardens with New York Times bestselling author Lisa See, whose memoir on Gold Mountain has been turned into an opera. And that's going to be a fun day trip up there to have dinner with her at a Chinese restaurant and to the show. We also do weekly Fireside interviews, so you can catch us on Fireside. We also do Zoom sessions. And just curious about you, Liz. I know that this is a virtual event because I'm in Southern California and you're in New England, but are you going to be doing any in-person touring, any in-person events?
Yeah, the links to all those are on my website. I'm adding a couple of more this week, but right now I am local to me in Massachusetts on Saturday, and then I will be down the Cape, I believe, on the 26th, and then I have a couple more that are also in real life as well. So I hope to see some of you there at some point.
Yeah, if anybody in our audience is in New England, yes, that would be great. You can visit her in person, check out her website. Um, and other than that, I think we are good. And once again, Darling Girl, just out. It's a beautiful book, really fabulous story, interesting plot and theme, and I loved reading it. Really enjoyed it. So enjoy your reading. I hope you come back and visit us sometime. And we'll see you next week with Jacinta Townsend as our next event. Thank you,
Thank
which is a
you.
bone deep and unsparing portrayal of the ethical and emotional claims we make upon one another in the name of survival and the name of love. So until next time, thank you everybody for joining us. And
Thank
ask
you, Susan.
yourself
Thank
this
you, everyone.
question.
Thank you.
Thank you, Liz. Thank you to our audience, our live audience in the stage below, but also to those of you who tuned in on our public profile page on any of our social media channels as well. So until next time, ask yourself this question: what is your next adventure by the book? Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.